Life in the Mesolithic was very different compared to life in modern times. Survival was your main objective in life. But here in the Middle Stone Age, the Mesolithic, life started to slowly change, and this led to the worship of nature and natural phenomenon. This also led to rituals surrounding the life cycle from birth until death, including various burial rituals and potential shamanism, particularly the use of masks and the idea of humans being able to communicate with spirits. All of this became part of life back during the Mesolithic times. My name is Kaylee, and I will tell you all there is to know about a woman who lived in the modern-day area of Germany during the Mesolithic, who was possibly a shaman in her community. So I will tell you all about this woman, her burial, and some information about the time period in which she was alive. And in a separate video on his channel, Stefan Milo will tell you all about a man who lived in the modern-day area of the United Kingdom during the Mesolithic. And this man is better known as Cheddar Man. But before we jump right into the discovery of the woman who's better known as the shaman of Bad Dürrenberg and what we have learned about her life and death, it's probably best to take a quick look into the time period that she lived in to give you more of an understanding about the way the world worked when she was still alive. I actually recently made a video about life during the Mesolithic in Europe on my channel, but in case you haven't seen it yet or just to freshen up your memories, I'll give a shortened summary here. The Mesolithic is a time period in the Stone Age that came after the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, and it came before the Neolithic, the New Stone Age. So it's often also referred to as the Middle Stone Age at times. So this time period of the Mesolithic is characterized by climate change after the last glacial period of the Ice Age came to an end, and we entered a warmer interglacial period. I explained the entirety of how ice ages work with glacial periods, interglacial periods, stadials, interstadials, all that fun stuff in my Sundaland video. So if you haven't seen that yet, highly recommend, because I explain it as if it's like Ice Ages Explained 101. So after we entered that warmer interglacial period, we entered the Mesolithic. Although the Mesolithic started and ended not at the same time globally, it's more so that we see a gradual change from the Old Stone Age into the Middle Stone Age at different points in time for different locations. But since this video is focusing on a woman who lived in what is modern-day Germany, we will look at the Mesolithic period in Europe, which started at the earliest around 15,000 years ago and ended around 5,500 years ago. As the Younger Dryas ended and the climate started to warm, the tundra started to change into forests. The herds of large animals moved away from this changing landscape as they followed the colder climate northeast to where the tundra remained. And in these new forests that started growing, new animals started to inhabit these areas, like deer and wild boar, which led to the humans needing to change their hunting strategies. So one of the distinctive features of the Mesolithic period is the use of microliths, which are stone tools smaller than 5 centimeters that were used in composite tools. The people during the Mesolithic started to build their settlements near seas or lakes, which ensured an abundance of food, as they were able to fish or hunt birds and gather small animals way more easier this way. The people also started to gather fruits and nuts that these forests brought with them. In fact, hazelnuts became a significant contributor to the diet of the people living in Mesolithic Europe. And it's even possible that the hazelnut may have been the first cultivated plant here in Europe. As you can imagine, most structures from the Mesolithic were small settlements. Some of them were semi-permanent dwellings, while others were simple wind shelters, most likely only used during certain seasons. During the Mesolithic, there were various burial practices, and the most common method was inhumation, or in other words, simply said, the burying of the dead. This was often done in an upright seated position, but extended position where the body laid on its back like we do in modern times, or in a flexed position where the body had its limbs tightly bent or bound, were done as well. Most of the burials were filled with grave goods like tools, animal remains, jewelry, and ornaments made from bones, animal teeth, and shells. And the types and quality of the grave goods, especially when it comes to, the graves with higher quality riches, suggests a hierarchical societal structure. The burial was often accompanied by red ochre and may have consisted of a single human, multiple humans, or a collective, and infant burials were often highly decorated. Most burials from the Mesolithic, and later on also the Neolithic, are oriented to the cardinal points, often in a north-south or east-west alignment with the rising and setting of the sun, and some graves are potentially tied to specific geographical landmarks, which suggests a ritualistic aspect and significance. Sometimes the body within the grave would also be placed with their heads facing at cardinal directions or specific landmarks, or their limbs were being positioned in a deliberate way. The various burial practices show a ritualistic aspect in the way that the people living back then dealt with death and the cycle of life, as the people living in the Mesolithic may have had birthing huts as well, specifically designated to bringing new life into this world. So now that we know a little bit more about the Mesolithic period, how the people during this time lived, and have more of an insight into their burial practices, it is now time to take a look into the burial of the Shaman of Bad Dürrenberg. And to do that, we need to go back to the discovery of her grave. So the story of the discovery of the Shaman of Bad Dürrenberg starts nearly 100 years ago, all the way back in the spring of 1934, on a terrace above the east bank of the river Saale, in what is now a spa garden near the modern town of Bad Dürrenberg, in the German state of Saxony-Anhalt, where unbeknownst to the people, a grave was located with the Mesolithic remains of an adult and an infant. I would like to point out the timing of the discovery here, as this is important later in the video. The burial of the Shaman of Bad Dürrenberg was discovered in the months leading up to Hitler becoming Reich Chancellor. On May 4th, 1934, at these spa gardens near Bad Dürrenberg, workers were digging a trench for a water pipe. And while the workers were digging, they came across the burial site and numerous grave goods. After the grave was partially uncovered with the help of some local historians and reported to the State Institute for Prehistory in Halle, a conservator named Wilhelm Henning was contacted. Unfortunately, before Henning arrived at the burial site, an unknown number of artifacts were already removed from the grave, which makes it unclear how the bodies and the grave goods were exactly arranged. But that is not the most unfortunate thing about this discovery and the excavation. The spa gardens were actually scheduled to open on the following day, and this meant that there wasn't much time for the excavation itself, which was honestly extremely painful to find out as I was doing my research for this video. The excavation of the burial was done within a single day. And if you know a little bit about archaeological excavations, this means that the excavations were rushed and not carried out in a meticulous manner, and thus may have resulted in the loss of grave goods, the loss of fragments of bones. And we don't know the exact context in which the artifacts and remains were found. So unfortunately, as you can imagine, it wasn't precisely recorded how exactly the skeletal remains had been positioned in the grave, or where the grave goods had been located upon initial discovery. If the ground was disturbed and something was later interred into the grave, none of that is known. The only thing that was noted was the fact that there was an adult body found in the grave with a curved posture with the skull in a higher position than the body, and the upper arms were angled upwards, which indicated that the body was in a seated position. However, it has been said later on by someone who we don't know, but it was said that the skull of the adult inside the burial pit had been placed facing south. Although we don't know if that's true, we only know that it has been said. But if the rushed excavation wasn't the worst already, to make matters even worse, due to the time pressure, no photographs were taken during the excavations. And so the only records of the initial excavation are a simple 2-page report, a sketch of the plan, and profile elevations. Yeah, that was it. So by this time in the video, as you are watching this, you might wonder how much is even known about the burial itself? How much is known about the bodies that they discovered? Is there even a point in making this video? Well, yeah, I mean, there's always a point in making videos like these, but I am biased when it comes to learning more about people from ancient times. So honestly, you might not agree with me on this one, but you know, that would be a you problem, not me, because I want to learn more about the ancient world, and this video is part of that. So, what do we know about the burial? We know that the grave discovered in the spa gardens of Bad Dürrenberg was oriented from east-northeast to west-southwest, which is quite common for burials of this time period, as it aligns with the rising and the setting of the sun. I couldn't find if her head was on the east or the west part, so we don't know about that. This orientation, however, could be a representation of the birth and death of the life this person had lived, just like the rising and the setting of the sun, which marks the beginning and the end of a day, of a lifetime, you know. Therefore, these orientations of Mesolithic burials could be a representation or a symbol for the life once lived. The burial pit was 90 by 55 centimeters wide. On screen you can see the inches and feet. I often forget researching that for you guys, I'm sorry. And the burial pit was 146 centimeters deep, which is honestly not very large, and the soil on the lower 30 centimeters or so of the grave was mixed with red ochre, and therefore it was discolored. And this is all very clearly visible on the skeletal remains as well as the grave goods that were found inside the burial pit, as they have been colored by the red ochre. During the excavation, the remains of an infant were discovered between the thighs of the buried adult, and there has been a mention of one stone axe having been placed below the right upper arm of the adult in Henning's report. The positions of the other grave goods are unfortunately unknown. But what we do know is that there was an unusual number of grave goods for the Mesolithic period found here at the grave. Most graves from the Mesolithic in central Germany that have been discovered, you know, up until this point in time, contain either no grave goods or only a few objects, which are usually simple flint artifacts. But here at the Bad Dürrenberg grave, the researchers stumbled upon many grave goods, including antlers of a 2-year-old roe deer, which shows signs of defleshing or skinning. And these antlers most likely were a part of a headdress that were once worn by the woman. The researchers also discovered over 56 animal teeth in the grave. 33 incisors and 3 canines were identified. Half of these teeth had pierced roots. The pierced teeth belonged to wild boars, aurochs, red deer, roe deer, and steppe bison. Among these, the researchers also found 6 split boar tusks, and 2 of those were pierced and were most likely found in the neck area of the woman in the grave. The researchers also discovered a pierced fragment of hyoid bone belonging to a wild boar as well. And they also found 6 pierced incisors from a wild boar, which showed clear signs of wear. Numerous metatarsal bones from red deer and roe deer were found, and these showed signs of polishing and rounding and revealed traces of manufacture, and they were most likely used to drill holes in other bones. The antler base of a red deer was also heavily reworked and turned into a pierced implement, most likely used to drill holes in other bones as well. One of these red deer metatarsal bones had been split lengthwise, with signs of wear at the tip. And at the tip, the researchers noticed a strong red ochre adhesion on the inner side, which could match a piece of red ochre that shows signs of wear. 3 lower jaw halves, 1 incisor, and 3 scapula fragments of at least 2 separate roe deer were found in the grave, as well as an unmodified thoracic vertebrae fragment and the metacarpal bone of a roe deer. The lower jaw halves are the only bones from this lot that show modifications by the hands of humans, which most likely occurred when the bones were still fresh, you know, fresh after the kill. They also discovered a hawk bone from a beaver and a shoulder blade of a hedgehog, and many more smaller bone fragments that could either not be determined to which body part it belonged or to what animals they belonged to. 120 fragments of river mussels from various species with red ochre residues attached to them were also found in the grave, as well as 64 fragments of at least 3 separate European pond turtle shells. And yeah, that's a lot of animal bones. But the researchers came across much more than just animal bones. They found 2 flint flakes, 7 flint blades, and a piece of flint debris. They also found 29 flint microliths and 2 microlith flakes, which were discovered in the right upper arm bone of a crane that had been hollowed out and prepared as a container. 4 groundstone artifacts were found in the grave as well, and one of these is the polished flatstone axe blade mentioned earlier that was found under the upper right arm of the woman. This polished flatstone axe blade was made of amphibolite, which is a metamorphic rock typically dark-colored and dense with little to no quartz. The other 3 stones found in the grave were 2 shaped and polished pebbles, one was made flat and oval shaped, and a hammerstone with signs of use and red ochre traces. And all of these mentioned grave goods were discovered during that initial excavation in 1934. And as I told you earlier, this really is an unusual number of grave goods, which suggests that the individual buried here was of quite some importance to the people who buried her. So now that we know all about the contents that were found inside the grave, and the fact that it shows that the adult individual buried in it held quite some importance, it is time to look into who was buried in the grave and figure out their story, figure out what we know about them. Back when the grave was first discovered, the researchers, of course, assumed that the grave belonged to a man from the Neolithic period, and this had everything to do with the polished axe head and the polished blades, as well as the amount of grave goods discovered inside the grave. Therefore, it must have been a man of a high status in the eyes of the researchers back in 1934. Biological anthropologist G. Herberer studied the skull and determined that it must have belonged to an adult male. Apparently he wasn't as good in his work as he really thought, because he was wrong. But if we think back to the moment where I told you to take note of the timing of the discovery earlier in this video, then you may start to put some of the puzzle pieces together already. Unfortunately, this particular burial that was wrongly assigned to have belonged to a male of high status dating from the Neolithic was assigned as having been the burial of an Aryan. And this was used and worked into Nazi propaganda. Which, of course, as you can imagine, further strengthened their pseudoscientific claims of the so-called Aryan race, the master race, and this has played its part in the extermination of the subhumans and inferior races, the Jews, Roma, Slavs, Poles, Czechs, Russians, Serbs, black people, and honestly anyone that didn't look enough Scandinavian, as the Nordic people were considered the purest stock of Aryan. It's despicable. We all know what happened during the Second World War and the atrocities that were committed during that time. And it honestly really sucks that this burial was used in Nazi propaganda, especially because they couldn't have been further from the truth. So who was really buried in the grave and what did they look like? The skeleton was re-examined in the 1950s and was concluded to have been a female. But as you can imagine, people kept being unconvinced, so in the 1990s the skeleton was once again re-examined, and once again it was concluded that the individual really was a woman. Back in the 1970s, the femur of the female buried in the grave, as well as 2 roe deer bones, were dated. And this led to an estimate date between 7000 and 6800 BCE, which means that she was buried between 9000 and 8800 years ago, which would have been during the time when Doggerland was still in full glory. Also, the same time when the younger parts of the Taştepeler sites in Turkey were still being constructed. Just to give you an idea of how long ago this truly was, right smack dab in the middle of the Mesolithic. The The skeleton was well preserved and largely recovered during the 1934 excavation, and it was determined that she was between the ages of 30 and 40 years when she died. She is estimated to have been around 155 centimeters in height, which equated to roughly 5'1", if I'm not mistaken. And she would have had a slender build, broad cheekbones, and some robust overall features. The infant found in the grave was always assumed to have been the child of the woman, although its sex hadn't been determined initially because it had not yet developed the decisive traits yet, but it was estimated to have been between 6 and 8 months of age. The area of the spa gardens at Bad Dürrenberg were scheduled for redevelopment for the 2022 State Garden Show, and this led to the grave being located once more in 2019, as they were, planning for this garden show. And after the grave was located, it was removed in its entirety for controlled excavations in a laboratory. During this new controlled excavation, additional smaller bones from the hands and feet and spine of the woman were found, and more bones of the infant were discovered as well, which eventually led to the baby being identified. And then in 2022, the remains of the shaman of Bad Dürrenberg were among the highlights of an exhibition at the British Museum in London. But this led to many questions arising from the public who wanted to know and learn more about how our ancestors must have lived during the Mesolithic. And they wanted to learn more about this enigmatic person that lived so long ago. And this led to researchers picking up the cold case of the shaman of Bad Dürrenberg in search for answers of who she once was, who the infant in her grave was, and what her life would have been like, because she must have been an important figure for the people around her to have been adorned with such a beautiful grave filled with beautiful grave goods. So, a genetic study was carried out at the Max Planck Institute to try and answer some of these questions surrounding the shaman of Bad Dürrenberg and the baby discovered with her in the grave. So the skeleton of the baby found in her grave was largely fragmentary and incomplete, but X-rays showed that there was no evidence of health issues, although re-examination did find some signs of vitamin deficiency. Genetic analysis identified the sex of the baby as having been male, and the genetic testing found that he was not the child of the shaman, but rather a 4th or 5th degree genetic relative with a shared mitochondrial haplogroup. The shaman may have been his either great-great-grandmother, although that would have meant that he was later buried within her grave, of which we don't have any evidence of, again, rushed excavations. They may have destroyed those signs, but there is a possibility that the shaman may have been the aunt or cousin several generations removed of the baby boy, which means that they may have been alive at the same time and thus died around the same time, which led to them being buried together, which is very possible. The genetic study of the shaman revealed that she most likely had a dark complexion, with straight dark hair and blue eyes, which was a very common combination of physical features for people living in Europe during the Mesolithic, and definitely not white-skinned with blonde hair and blue eyes like that Aryan Nazi propaganda tried to push. Dark skin, dark hair, blue eyes. Losboer man from Luxembourg and Cheddar man from Britain shared these physical traits with the shaman of Bad Dürrenberg. And don't forget to check out Stefan's video on Cheddar man when you are finished watching this one. Study of the shaman's mitochondrial DNA found that she had the haplogroup U4, which is typical of the Mesolithic, and her specific subclade was U4B1B1. During these new investigations into her life and death, the researchers discovered that her bones actually lacked the strong muscle attachments, which indicated that she was less active compared to other individuals who lived during this period in time. They also discovered signs of wear to the vertebrae in her lower back and torso, combined with facets on her leg bones that indicate that she had spent a lot of time kneeling. But her overall health seemed to have been good. The two highest vertebrae in her neck, which are known as the atlas and the axis vertebrae, were missing large portions of their posterior arches, which is the bony structure that forms part of the canal through which the spinal cord passes. And the hole in the base of her skull, better known as the foramen magnum, had malformations. At first, when her body was examined in the 1950s, this was suggested to have been caused by decapitation. But there's no evidence of decapitation or cut marks on her skull or her neck, so it's most likely something that she was born with. But due to the malformation of the foramen magnum, in combination with missing the posterior arches of the atlas and axis vertebrae, she may have been able to block blood vessels to the brain if she held her head in certain positions. And her doing this may have led to a variety of neuropathological conditions, like for instance the sensations of burning, itching, or crawling skin. But this also may have caused ataxia, which are uncoordinated movements within her body, abnormal movements of her eyes and speech changes, as well as rapid eye movements, which is better known as nystagmus, or causing double vision. This may have made her look like she had access to supernatural abilities to the people, living around her, as if she was conversing with the spirits, the gods, the dead. I mean, it's not too far-fetched. Her two upper front teeth were worn and the pulp cavity was exposed, which is often caused by holding objects such as leather between the teeth for a long period of time. But the wear of her particular teeth don't match with those usual signs, and the lack of secondary dentin formation indicates that the wear on her teeth actually happened quickly. Therefore, the researchers are of the opinion that her teeth may have been deliberately filed down as part of a ritual, and the open pulp cavities led to infection in one of the teeth, and this led to the formation of an abscess that spread to the maxillary sinus, and it has been suggested that this was the cause of her death. It's important, however, to remember that large parts of modern-day Germany were covered by dense forests and were very sparsely populated, and this woman lived in this environment. And we know that the people who lived during this time in this area organized themselves primarily in groups of hunters and gatherers who were highly mobile and rarely stayed in one place for long. So the life of this woman, showing that she was way less active than the people who lived around her, combined with her physical traits and her possible abilities to control her neuropathological conditions by blocking off blood vessels to the brain, in combination with her elaborate burial and the presence of a roe deer headdress with antlers, has led to the suggestion that this woman may have been a shaman when she lived during the Mesolithic. And that is why we refer to her as the shaman of Bad Dürrenberg. What's even more intriguing is the fact that some 600 years after the shaman of Bad Dürrenberg was buried, a pair of deer antler headdresses were buried less than a meter, which equates to 3 feet, from her grave, which suggests that centuries after her death, she was still remembered and revered. The spectacular story of a female shaman who lived around 9,000 years ago, a beautiful grave filled to the brim with grave goods, an infant who was not her child but was related to her, the unknown circumstances of their deaths, the initial discovery of her grave, the Nazi propaganda that her death was used for, and the eventual genetic analysis that led to us learning who she was, it sounds almost like a fantasy story. But this happened in real life, which leaves me with one not so simple question for you watching this. What do you think of the shaman of Bad Dürrenberg? Let me know in the comments down below. And again, do not forget to check out the Chatterman deep dive on Stefan Milo's channel. But with that said, if you enjoyed watching, then don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe if you'd like to see more of these kind of videos, and click that bell icon if you want to be notified whenever I upload. If you haven't seen my previous videos, I highly recommend it, then click the card in the upper right corner, click one of the links in the description down below, or click a video in the end card. Highly recommend the Sundaland video, but that's just me promoting my own stuff. I would also like to say a massive thank you to my patrons and my channel members. Thank you so much for supporting me. I've also decided to do a live stream every week where I play a game that's either based in like the Mesolithic or Neolithic, or it's another historical game. I tried Ancestors, the Humankind Odyssey. It's a very difficult game. I gave up. So next week for my birthday stream, we are going to play Far Cry Primal. And like I said, it's going to be my birthday stream because I will be streaming on Thursday, and at midnight I'm turning 34. I rarely ever play games anymore because I just don't have the time. And I love games that, you know, play out in history. See me on Thursday, and with that said, I'll see you in the next video. Bye!